Happy New Year and welcome to the Endurance Podcast. This is the first episode of 2025 and we welcome chef and nutritionist Nicki Strobel, who works for Israel Premier Tech professional cycling team. In this episode, we talk all about nutrition in professional cycling and the differences in the role between a nutritionist and chef. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Endurance Podcast with myself, Alex Rhodes, and Dr. Tim Podlogar. Happy New Year to all the listeners, and we hope that you enjoyed our last episode of 2024, where we took your questions and answered them as best as we could. If you haven't listened to it yet, go and listen to it. There were some fantastic questions, some great discussion around some of the topics. So hopefully that was really useful for yourself. And looking forward into 2025, there's some more great news that Endurance is now a proud sponsor of Israel Premier Tech cycling team. So if you're a fan of the sport and you're watching it on TV, you'll know likely start to see some of those products being out there in the pro field. So getting back to the normal day today, how are you, Tim?
Hi, Alex. I'm doing well. It's grim in the UK, but I have a lot of work, so that's
when is it not? We seem to have this frequent conversation, so it's just a given that that's the normal now.
Yeah, I guess so. I will never get used to this weather. So,
but the nice thing is that we are kind of coming out, or certainly I feel we're coming out of that, because kind of around December, we have that bit of a shutdown and, working from a coaching perspective, people are having time off and there's not so much events unless you're into cyclocross, which, has been in full swing over the past couple of months. But people are starting to get back motivated for training. We're starting to see some events come back on. We're obviously, at the time of this recording, we've just starting the Tour Down Under. And there's still some cyclocross going on there. So certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, we're starting to see some of that come back in. And that kind of excites me because that's the world I live in and enjoy. But I suppose, is there anything in the year that you're looking forward to from an event perspective?
Not really.
Is Tour de France a big highlight for you, or?
I don't know. I hope there will be a cool study published at some point. So that's
Just
what I'm excited about.
Research. Whatever research is going to come out, you're interested in.
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, that's great. So I do have a question for you, actually, which is very much related to the guest that we're going to speak to today. How are your skills in the kitchen? Like, we know that you're, a vastly accomplished nutritionist and physiologist, and, that's all being well, understanding, macros and timing. But, what skills have you got in the kitchen?
Can I get to go somewhere? I don't want to reply to this question.
You don't want to answer it?
No. Just kidding. I think they're improving. So I'm actually cooking more than my girlfriend is. So that means that I'm cooking quite a lot. I try to not eat Haribo every day, but I used to eat pretty much like it was yogurt and Haribo every single day, but then I changed that, and now I'm actually cooking food and trying to be eating healthy.
Just getting the basics in, the functional, the functional side of it, because it is interesting that, it's okay, understanding some of these things, but how we implement it, what different ways people understand and apply nutritional practices can be, totally different across sports and individuals. So it's always good. And sometimes I used to enjoy just experimenting in the kitchen, but then when you start thinking about, it being a bit more time specific and functional to what you're going to do, you kind of bring it down a little bit more basic and go, okay, right, I've just got that rice, like that's what I'm going to eat, or and that's my carbs, and I've got my protein there, rather than this this elaborate meal that we can make. But that's a great segue into the guest that we've got today, because it's going to be fascinating that he operates on both levels. He's a chef, but he's also a nutritionist. And he currently works within the Israel Premier Tech cycle team. And we're going to dive into what knowledge he has and what experience he has in juggling those two practices. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest today, which is Nicki Strobel. Good morning, Nicki.
Good morning. How are you guys?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. I was just, when you guys were talking about the weather, I was just looking outside and it's like, it's not better in Norway. I can tell you that.
You're a little bit further north than us, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure it'd be how much better it would be.
No, like I'm in the most southern part of Norway now, but we still get a lot of like beautiful clear days compared to it just being gray. So it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I know a lot from a cross country background, and some of the athletes, and obviously the Scandinavian countries, especially Norway, is it's very big there. In the region that you're in, do you get a lot of snow at this time of year, or is it a bit more wet and the snow is higher up?
Um, where we are now, it's a bit more wet. We used to be in basically in the North Pole. So up there we had a lot of snow. But Norwegians they go crazy for their cross country skiing. Like it's the national sport here. Every other country they look for, the Olympics, the World Championships in soccer and stuff like that. But here in Norway, it's the cross country. Like the whole country will shut down during the Winter Olympics.
Nice, nice. Because yeah, like even though we say, oh, the weather's like this, like for it to be, I've spent time in the mountains and stuff. It can be very cold, but if there's snow on the ground and there's blue sky, then it could be pretty perfect.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. The biggest problem here compared to the Alps and stuff like that is that we don't really get those like nice warm days. It's pretty cold, especially when you go inland. It'll drop down to like -20, and it's not a nice cold. It's like chilling to the bone cold.
Yeah, yeah, I can appreciate that. So, for moving on to more of a warm weather sport, but for the purpose of the listeners, I've presented that you're a chef and a nutritionist within the team. But if you could just give a little bit of a description around your role, what you kind of do within the team.
Yeah, so my role is sort of split 50-50 between the two. A lot of the nutrition work I'll do from home, make meal plans, stuff like that for the riders, um, do nutrition for the different races and stuff like that. And then as a chef on the road, it's obviously more practical, providing the food for the riders on a day-to-day basis, um, but still sort of juggling the role between those two when you're on the road. So I'll do, one day you'll have to do body composition with the riders and stuff like that. So you're sort of in the kitchen in the morning, then quickly out to do some body composition with one of the riders, and then back into the kitchen. I think because those two roles they're working so close together, it's kind of hard to define when you're doing one or the other. At least when you're on the road. At home, it's a bit easier. It's not often that I have to cook from home and sort of send it to the guys. So I think it works well. But when you're on the road, it can be hard balancing both at the same time.
And how many do you attend all the races? Because obviously, as a nutritionist, you can do quite a lot of that remotely. But as a chef, you need to be there in person to do these things, and there's training camps and there's races. So do you spend a lot of time on the road doing that?
Um, I normally travel between 100 to 120 days. Some days will be just as a nutritionist on the road. That's especially around our training camps, making sure that everything is set up as it's supposed to and doing more practical work with the riders in those camps. That's normally where you have time to do different tests or do some, specific work around in-race fueling or something like that. So we normally try to utilize the nutritionist role more at camps rather than at races, because at races, all of the work around nutrition, body composition, all of those things should probably be done before you show up to a race. So at the race, it's more hands-on and just delivering good food for the riders.
Yeah, and it must be really nice in a way, although whether it feels like a juggle because you're doing two roles and two jobs, they blend in with each other. And I guess some of the difficulty that you might face in I wouldn't say a traditional team where there's lots of different ways of doing this, but a traditional team where you have a nutrition, you have a chef that's separated. And Tim, you might have some experience of this. Right, I'm looking at this, on paper or a spreadsheet, or and I'm looking at the numbers, and I'm looking at time, and this is what we've got to get, and we've got to get X amount of carbs, this amount of protein. But then to translate that over to cooking it into real food, if those two are not aligned, I imagine you can get quite some discrepancies of saying this is actually what I want, but then the chef is doing something else, because you have to make food palatable, you have to make it taste good for the riders. Have you had any experience of that, Tim, where that relationship has to be quite close to know that the riders are getting what you want them to get?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty useless when it comes to like food selection and like prescribing actual food to the riders or like athletes, because I don't have any dietitian background. So in my previous team, like we had in the last season a dietitian. So basically, the nutritionist would come up with the desire to like have like a high carbohydrate, low fiber, low sodium or whatever diet, and then the dietitian would translate that into food, or at least like give ideas to the chef, and then the chef would then make the food. So it was like a middle person, and it was just like another factor of complication in there.
So that, in a way, Nicki, that must be really nice that you can go, right, I know what they should be having, and now I get to go make it. So I
Yeah,
really
no,
do know what they're having.
100%, and I can only say that when I'm in the kitchen, a lot of teams now have like kitchen vehicles where they will cook in a mobile kitchen. But in the past, a lot of times you would go into the kitchen at the hotel, use it, and you would see other teams, talk with other chefs and stuff like that. And a lot of the you know, chefs, they don't appreciate the work that the nutritionists do, because they're focused on, flavor and taste, and they want to deliver something to the riders that the riders really like. And you know, b- being a chef, I think most people who go into that role, they are, they have that sort of, service mind. So they want to service people, they want happy customers, because that's how a chef work. Um, So I've seen a lot of, chefs talk with nutritionists and not give a damn about what the nutritionist says, because, like if something needs more butter, then it needs more butter. Like they're not going to change that. So having that understanding from both roles and sort of appreciating what you're trying to achieve as a nutritionist and as a chef has been a great benefit for me. And I think a lot of teams in general would really improve their, food offering and stuff like that if they educated both chefs and nutritionists just a little bit to sort of appreciate the work that each profession do. Um, it as Tim mentioned, he's very good at macros and calculating that side of things, but translating that into food, uh, a chef can do way better at that. But if the chef then understands what macros are and how to translate that into the food that he normally does, you can actually get a chef that can be a big help compared to I've seen a lot of, and Tim might have experienced this, a lot of chefs and nutritionists on the road having massive discussions around food and what they should be cooking for the riders and how much. So I think me having both sides of the table in my mind, you can sort of it makes it easier for me to understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, because that is fascinating because they are like, it's really interesting that you said, as a chef, or certainly I imagine being educated as a chef is about service and taste and everything around that. And we only know if we go to, say, some fine dining places that the food is rich, there's salt, there's fat in there, and that makes food taste good. But as an athlete, and and to be quite functional about that as well, some of that has to be we can't always have that. So how do you balance kind of that, I want this to taste good for the riders, but I know that this, needs this kind of composition. We need this amount of macros, perhaps not too much sodium at this time, things like that. How do you balance that between the two things? Do you kind of, I suppose, plan that in advance? Because then when you're on the road, you need to source, some of those foods and things.
Yeah, I think one of the things, like first of all, I'm terrible at planning, so I'll normally plan like a day or two ahead, and that's sort of what my mind can do when I'm on the road. Um, Also because I don't like getting to a place and you're going to the market and all of the things you can find there, they're not what you planned for. So now all of a sudden you have to change everything. So I like it more like having a rough outline and then filling in more of a day-to-day basis. Around when you're like trying to balance out the different macros and stuff in the meals. One of the great things about having my education as a nutritionist as well is that I know where we can sort of make something a bit more rich and make that super tasty and then balancing it out with other things. So if you make a dessert that's pretty high in carbs, then instead of having pasta, you could swap that for potatoes instead, because that can give them you know less carbs. They can still get quantity, so they get full, and then you can sort of top it up with a dessert. So having those skills definitely makes it easier on a day-to-day basis to balance things out. And um, I think most chefs they have a basic understanding of fats and stuff like that, but a lot of them don't really appreciate the difference in, especially in carbs, uh, which is a lot of the times you see on a easy stage that they plan to do like a big pasta, but that means that a rider can have 100 grams of pasta, and a bike rider will not settle for 100 grams of pasta. They normally want like triple or quadruple that. So those are some of the things that makes my job a lot easier, that I have that knowledge, but it also, at least I hope, for the nutritionists I'm working with when I'm on the road as a chef, make their life easier, because I'm pretty good at adapting to that. And maybe Tim has a different experience from teams that he's been with, that having having chefs sort of have a basic understanding can make a big difference, and that a lot of chefs they just do what's nice and not really what's correct for the macros.
Do you have experience with that, Tim?
Well, yeah, yeah. I would rather not talk too much about that. But yeah, I think like when I started like working in professional cycling, I had absolutely no clue what the chefs are educated on, like what they know about macros. I thought that was basically a common knowledge about carbohydrates, fats, and protein, but it's not. So you need to basically explain it to them. And even then, like they would be like, yeah, but today it's cold day, so we need a bit more carbohydrates or more energy. And I'm like, no, doesn't work like that. And it's just like sometimes a bit of a fight. And I know they want to basically please the riders and make the riders happy, but at the same time, you're like very conscious about like energy balance, because in a few days' time, like the riders will come to you and complain about his weight going up or down, whichever way. It's not gonna be very nice conversation to have, either with the rider or the sports director. So it's kind of like really tough, and it's really good if the chef actually does understand what's going on and has an idea. And another thing that I was basically finding out over the years is that like the chef is pretty much the only person that doesn't like go to the race and has absolutely no clue what's happening in the actual race. So for the chef, it's basically every day the same. You just like move the hotel, you like buy the food, you prepare the food, and then you change the hotel the next day. And the rest of us, like go to the race and like hand out the bottles. We see the riders after the stage. We know how tired they are, but the chef doesn't see that. And I feel like sometimes we forget about that, and we don't provide really enough information to the chefs. So I try to improve that over the years, but I still think that like, yeah, this communication really needs to be much better.
Yeah, and ultimately it's about keeping the riders happy, isn't it? That, you know, especially some of the, you know, the Grand Tours and things like that. They are hard, you know, hard days time after time. And if, you know, there's something to look forward to in having your, you know, your dinner or your food, it can just help that. And obviously we know there's a social aspect around being at the dinner table and, you know, reflecting on the stage and things like that. So very important places on all accounts for everyone who's involved in that to be understanding and in alignment. So let's talk about the riders, because, you know, those are ultimately the people who we provide information and food to. So, you know, on average, you know, what does a rider's daily nutrition look like for someone at that level?
I think you know it's actually a very hard question to answer, because the differences are so big on a day-to-day basis. You know, especially when we're doing a good example is the classics, where you would do, you know, a big day where it might be like 5 to 6 thousand calories on the bike, and then you will have 2 days where you do maybe an hour ride to the cafe and have a coffee and then back. So on those days it might be like 300 or 500. So I think it's very hard to sort of say, oh, this is what's standard. And I think that's also, you know, historically, bike riders, they would eat a lot and they would be way under fueled on big days, and they would be way over fueled on easy days. Whereas now, you know, the smarter we've gotten, we can sort of see that, okay, maybe it's better to actually try and match the energy intake with the output. So today it's very hard to say what they eat on average, but like when we do the Tour de France, anything from like 15 grams of carbs per kilo up towards like above 20 grams per kilo on the stages is pretty normal. Um, and you know, putting that into food, it's a lot of rice and pasta if you have to just eat it that way. Um, so, I've been in cycling for 20 years. When I first started in cycling, having 30 grams of carbs per hour, that was the gold standard. And then, a few years later, some crazy people, they were like pushing 60 every hour, and they was like, no way. This is not gonna work. Like people will sit on the side of the road, they'll end up, throwing up because it's too much carb to get in. And then after that, I think it was like, was it 2018 when Chris Froome won the Giro and they published that study and he did 90 grams an hour.
Yeah.
And people were like, that's, out of this world, 90 grams an hour. How can you do that? And now, like we have this one drink from Endurance and it's 90 grams of carbs in one bottle. And people are, especially in colder races where you don't drink so much, people are happily drinking a 90-gram bottle and then topping up with a gel to get to like 120 grams an hour. So I think actually bike riders might eat less food now than they did in the past because they're fueling so much better and more efficiently on the bike. You know, first of all, there's been a lot of science done in it, but also just that there's like the products that we use on the bike now, they are complete different quality compared to what they used to be. You see far less people having, upset stomach and stuff like that because we actually have drinks and gels and stuff like that that works well and are tolerated in those high amounts that the riders need.
Yeah, and I think, your experience and duration of, over 20 years in that field, there has, and it is rapidly evolved over time. And, just like you said, you see some of those things, things like, what it's certainly even in my younger days experiences, protocols around carb loading. And, this might be like 3 days, 5 days, people just eating tons of pasta. And it goes back to my question around, what typically the rider's eating or what does it look like from day to day? And I think you highlighted, really where it has gone in the past 5 years or so is that periodization of nutrition based on the demands. And this can be, day to day. And I think that some of it is attributable to the performances that we are seeing. People are fueling better. People are optimizing weight and energy requirements a lot better. So are those kind of the standout things that you've seen over the 20 years? Obviously, there's the intra-fueling, which, you've just discussed, but that real development and, nuance to apply fueling for the work required.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. Like riders are just, first of all, they're more professional today. When I first started, it was pretty common that, riders would have wine, beer with their dinner. Um,
If
they
you go
were
back
more.
far enough, they used to have beers during the race.
I can tell you, like one of the first years when I did the Vuelta on the last stage, a few riders asked me to get them beer so they could put beer in their bottles on the last stage, so they could do like beers on the bike. Um, but I think in cycling and in anything in general, we go through these cycles, and the pendulum might swing a bit too far to one side, and then we go a bit too far to the other side. Um, Especially that would have been like what, like 2012, 13. The low carb came in, and you would
Yeah.
see like bike riders trying to do like a full day race with a low carb breakfast, and they would do 6 hour trainings just fueling on fat gels and whatever they could get their hands on. And now we're like the complete opposite sides where you're hearing, most bike riders are pushing 120 grams per hour, and you hear about triathletes pushing up towards like 200 grams an hour. So I think we're trying to, push the pendulum as far to that side now we can go, and then we probably land somewhere like in the middle where it's a sweet spot. But um, luckily now, and Tim is doing a lot of work in this as well around the whole fueling and how we best fuel. To see those boundaries pushed, I think that's good. There's always a difference between what you can do in a lab and what's practical on the road, and what people can actually stomach. But no, I think the biggest thing now is that a lot of riders are just more educated, and a lot of them have seen that it's a key part of their performance is nutrition. Whereas before, if you could ride your bike, you could win bike races, but now you need to pay a bit more attention to detail.
Yeah, yeah, and we are just seeing those advancements, coming so rapidly. So, um, just kind of going on to fill the a round picture there. We spoke about macros and how those might be implemented, races, harder training days. But I would say probably more, whether it's more or less complex point is around hydration as well, and especially for the the hotter season and things like that. How do you work with the athletes on that? Because we can do some calculations, we can do some things, but we know in science and practice, it's never all that accurate. How do you work with the riders from a hydration perspective?
Um, well, it's a good question, and I think each athlete will be very individual on this point. But a lot of the things that we do around hydration would be like hydration monitoring, so pre and post weight before while they're doing races and stuff like that. Um, Luckily, we have a good collaboration with some universities, so we have the opportunity to test like sweat sodium to see how much of that of the sodium they're losing through the sweat. Um, and you know, from time to time, you'll get athletes that don't really care, and they'll do their own thing until it doesn't work, and then all of a sudden, hydration is the most important thing. But having having good hydration is obviously key, and a easy way to do it now is that you can get good drink mixes, and you can sort of do like two birds with one stone. You get your hydration in, you get your carbs in, and stay on top of it in that way. But I would say, it's very hard again in cycling because it's not in a lab. So the way that we monitor things will be very basic on the road with like USG, uh, simple like pre and post weights.
Yeah, cool. And I think, it's an important thing to highlight there, which we often, myself and Tim, and the industry discusses quite a lot, that sometimes we can get, paralysis by analysis with some things, where actually just the basic fundamentals and, catering to the rider's individuality is probably sometimes the best way to go, because they know that, rather than overcomplicating some situations. And like you say, obviously, if it's not going right, it can be addressed, and try to understand how that can be improved. But it's nice that it's just we get back to basics, and we just make sure that we're doing those correct first, which can get quite lost in this field for sure. So working with the riders, like, what do you find? Let's go from both perspectives. So put your nutrition hat on, or your chef hat on. What do you find is the hardest part of working with the athletes?
Um, as a chef, it can be there's sort of two sides of being a chef with the athletes. When you're at races, one is athletes who don't have great appetite, So that can be quite challenging trying to cater to that while you at the same race might have someone who has a big appetite and just want more food. So getting that balance right and having, to work with different athletes trying to achieve different things can be hard as a chef. And also we normally say, like, if you do a bike race and there's 8 bike riders, there's normally 10 different opinions about what they would like for dinner. Um, and as you mentioned before, like they, even though that we're not at the race, when we see them at dinner and stuff like that, a lot of them, they're very tired, and you can see that it's hard on them. So sometimes, they find little things to sort of focus on, and sometimes that can be the food. That can be quite challenging when you're doing something and you're doing it right, but a bike rider decided that it's not right for them, um, and without sort of throwing anyone under the bus, but goddamn Italians, you know, I don't know what it is, but other people, they focus on aerodynamics or something like that. Italians, it's on the pasta. Like if they don't feel well,
Of
it's because
course,
the
of
it's
course.
because the pasta was like undercooked, overcooked, and the thing is, I've worked with a few Italians, and every time they like, oh, can you make this or that? And you make it for them. I never heard any of them not say that, it's good, but it's not as good as my mom's.
So speaking of pasta, now a question: do you cook pasta fresh for each rider, or do you put it in a big bowl?
Um, so I'm a bit more strict than some chefs. So I normally put it in a big bowl, and it's on the table at the time. It's supposed to be on the table. So if you want it, right then, you need to be at the table. Unless you send me a message, then I'm happy to sort of, cater for you out of that timeline. But um, I think working with athletes, a lot of the times people try to please, and you just end up with athletes that get a bit disconnected from real life. So we have a pretty strict rule that, you have to be on time, and the food is on the table at that time. And if you're not there and you didn't let any of the chefs know, then it's your fault. Um, but I see, Tim, I see different teams having different opinions on that, and I think it's also obviously I'm not Italian, so I think that might also play into it. Like pasta in Norway is not, we're not that focused on it. It doesn't matter if it's cooked like a few minutes too long. Doesn't really matter.
I mean, I used to work in a German team. I don't know how it is in the current team, but yeah, like pasta was not a big deal. But yeah, for Italians, it was always a problem. But so, like you mentioned that you have a set time. So do the riders always come as a group, or is it like smaller groups? Because like after long transfers and all the massages and stuff, just yeah.
It really depends. I think a lot of the times we try to keep it as one group, just to get that social interaction between the riders. Um, you know, a lot of the times that's where they sort of unwind. And I heard at a few dinners, them having talks about saying sorry about this and that during the day, and in the heat of the moment, uh, catching up, sort of evaluating the stage, but without sports directors, coaches, anything like that being present. So I think having them all together is probably my priority, but with logistics, it's not always possible. And as most people know, sitting having dinner by yourself, it's not that nice. Dinner is normally a social time, and we try to keep it that way. Also, to keep the food more enjoyable for the riders. Food just tastes better in company.
I think, that was just something that I mentioned prior to that it's not just about, I think it's important that they sit down, because it's not just about the eating as well. It's about the social aspect, and they're working hard for each other. And you think about the dynamics of a cycling team, they're a bunch of individuals that have to work for one another, and you only really get that desire through those social connections. All right, I know you're getting paid for it and it's your job, but I imagine that the teams that work well really have that close bond, and they sit down together after a stage or whatever, and they might reminisce about good, bad points about the stage. They might joke, and that builds that connection, that cohesiveness within that team, to then go, right, let's work together the next day. We're going to do this. So I think that's probably a real valuable point, and the fact that you're making there is, if they come in as individual, how much time you're spending solo thinking about things or not interacting with the other riders. So it might provide, a much more valuable environment, as well as obviously refueling.
Yeah, and also I think, we obviously see a lot of different teams on the road, and I would say the more successful teams over the past few years are definitely the ones where you see them having fun at the table. They're good friends, so they're also willing to probably go a bit deeper to help out a good teammate, compared to other teams where there's a bit of infight and they can't really agree, and it ends up being more a fight within the team instead of against other teams.
And you can see that. You could see it, you see it every year, but I observe that. I'm not gonna, mention any particulars, but you can see it within there in the teams that will do that for them. So yeah, hugely important. And do you find that whilst they're together, the fact that one of your roles as a nutritionist and a chef is that you're able to, do you find yourself educating at the time as well, which is probably what, if a chef's perhaps not as educated from a nutritional or dietitian perspective, then there's that added benefit to go, well, actually, this is gonna benefit you because of this.
Yeah, 100%. And I think being a chef at that point in time really works well for me, because you're not the bad nutritionist coming in saying you're not allowed to eat this and that. So it becomes a bit more relaxed compared to if you're just standing next to a table as a nutritionist. People sort of feel like you're watching them. The education part is really important on the road, and like it can be little things like a nutritionist send a plan where it's rice for breakfast, and a rider doesn't like rice for breakfast. Having my knowledge, we can swap it for something different, so we can make it into something that a rider likes. Um, that's a big benefit, and I think that's something that the riders also enjoy. They can always walk up to me and say, hey, one of the other nutritionists put bread for breakfast. I'm not really feeling it today. Can we change it for something else? And then we can find a solution on the spot, and instead of having riders who just eat whatever is planned for them, even though they're not liking it. I've seen riders who would eat rice for breakfast, and I was like, "You don't like rice?" And they're like, "No, no, but it was on my nutrition plan." I'm like, "Yeah, but do you enjoy it? Like that." I think that's a big thing. Especially they have to go through so much quantity. So if it's not enjoyable, it just becomes another burden on them to sort of
And it
go
makes the
through this.
whole process a lot harder as well. Like you have to have, all right, yeah, it's hard work, but some enjoyment. Like you say, if you're then finishing a super hard day and then going, oh, I don't really like the food that we're eating, then that's a real hard place to be in.
Yeah, and you can even see it, like, some bike riders, they'll like completely up when you tell them like, oh, you don't have to eat this, you can have a glass of juice instead and stuff, and they'll just be like, oh, like that was what just saved their day, that they didn't have to eat another 200 grams of rice or something like that. I
So
remember
how do you,
when
oh God,
so no, no, I remember when Haribo was first sort of introduced as a recovery food. Had writers who were like, "This is the best thing ever. I can eat Haribo now. Like I dreamed of this when I was a kid, where I could just eat a bag of Haribo every day."
amazing, amazing. So or do you find yourself frequently adjusting foods for personal or cultural preferences? Because things are quite dynamic nowadays from a nutritional perspective. We have people who have different food choices, vegetarians, vegans, intolerances, that kind of stuff. Do you find yourself frequently doing it, and how do you kind of cater for that within a team?
I would say I've been lucky to not have many athletes with specific dietary, needs or anything like that. So I'm probably not the right person to ask, but some teams there's a lot, and I think a lot of bike riders there will develop intolerance based on what they think they're intolerant to. You see them come up with weird things, and then you'll see them the next year, and they'll be like, "No, no, I'm not intolerant to that anymore." And I've seen bike riders who were intolerant to eggs, and you're like, it's quite a severe allergy, so it takes a lot of work to work around. Also, because you can kill someone if there's eggs in it or something like that.
Yeah.
And then you see them like a year later with a different team, and they're sitting having their fried egg for breakfast, and you're like, "Gee, what's going on here?" And they'll be like, "Oh yeah, by the way, like I'm actually not intolerant." I'm like, I went through all of this just because you thought that you were intolerant. So, um, but there is a lot of little things that you have to adjust to, and I think especially with the way that they're fueling now on the bike, it obviously puts a bit more stress on the whole digestive system, that you're eating so much, and they're probably more focused on it because they know that it's something that's important now. So they'll come with little things that you have to sort of adjust to, or try to avoid. But I think in general, if you educate your riders well and have good nutritionists that can sort of keep it down, it's actually not that big of a problem with special diets and
Yeah.
special needs.
And I think they're probably invested themselves now, because I don't necessarily believe that at that kind of level you can really perform at that level without being somewhat in tune to it. Back in the day, like you said, if you could just ride a bike well, you could do pretty well. Whereas now the performance level and the depth of performance is so high that you really do need to pay attention to the finer details when it comes to it. But my final question on that is, how do you keep the riders happy? I mean, some of it might be quite functional at times, and you're like, yeah, we've got to eat this kind of stuff. But what kind of things do you throw in there that keeps them happy?
A lot of them are quite happy when I serve desserts. I used to be a pastry chef at a
Oh,
Michelin
there we
star
go.
restaurant. So I do quite a lot of sweet things for them, because all of them just love that. And normally it's a good way to get a ton of carbs in a small amount of food. Um, I think that's the biggest thing. And then a lot of the riders, I do this freshly baked bread in the morning, and we have a lot of riders from the UK, Australia, Canada, stuff like that. And this bread, they call it the crumpet bread. So it's a bread that's like soft like a crumpet on the inside and have that texture. And that's a favorite. When I first came to the team, there was a rider that I worked with in the past, and he was so happy because the crumpet bread was back. So
it's making me hungry now. You're going to need to send me the recipe.
Like,
go on.
Yeah, just a question about the food and stuff. So when you basically have a rider that needs to lose body weight, do you then just give him the food that he doesn't like?
no, I try to probably go the other direction, give him something that he likes, but then make it something that fits within that diet. So, instead of serving him rice and pasta, you would go for more like like I mentioned, potatoes or sweet potatoes, something that's lower in carbs. Try to obviously cut away as much of the fat as possible, but you can still make delicious meals without sort of punishing them when they have to make weight. Um, I think, being in a calorie deficit by itself is hard enough. Most people who's done that know that it's not a nice feeling. Uh, so if you can make it more enjoyable and make it something that, makes you feel full and makes you feel like you had a good meal, it can make a big difference, and can make it a lot easier for riders to stay in that calorie deficit without feeling too much of a burden on them.
And another one, do you have any riders that don't like vegetables? Because I'm one of those people that really struggle to eat a lot of veggies.
Yeah, I have, Stevie Williams. I'm nutritionist for him, and I'm also obviously cooking for him at races and stuff like that. But that guy, he's not very big on vegetables, but he also doesn't have a great appetite. So it sort of works in his favor because that means that we can add, juices and stuff like that in and still actually get some of the benefit from vegetables. But I think that part is probably more, I have two kids at home and they don't like vegetables either. So it's probably more my experience working with my own two kids, trying to hide vegetables
I
in
have the
every
same
dish I
problem.
can.
I have the same problem.
You'd be amazed about how much vegetable you can put into a tomato sauce as long as it's still red and have like a vague taste of tomato. They'll be like, "Oh, this is great."
Amazing. A tip for all parents out there. And it's interesting that you mentioned there as well about like keeping the riders happy, especially, say if they are trying to get to race weight or, optimize that as well as being a calorie deficit, because you go back to like 2012, again, I'm not going to mention teams and people, but there's some stories that come out of there as well, where it was actually that some of the chefs were told to make food as bland and as boring as possible so that the riders didn't want to eat too much of it. So that kind of kept their intake lower naturally, rather than making it really delicious, get everything in there. But it sounds like, certainly the modern age, and I don't know if it's just your approach, but it sounds like, which I think is a healthy thing, to have a good association with food and enjoyment of food while still trying to optimize performance and things like weight.
Yeah, I think also to for the listeners who might not be aware of like the historical side of cycling, but nutrition has only been a big part of cycling in the last, say, maybe 5 years or something like that. Um, Before that, everything was handled by, normally it would be the team doctor, and before 2011, all recovery, everything like that was handled through an IV with just glucose, which is the best and fastest way to recover. It might not be the best way from like a point of keeping things separated. Um, so having nutrition in cycling has been, first of all, it's actually a very hard field to work in, and Tim will probably agree on this one because everyone have an opinion on nutrition and everyone think they know about food. which is normal because, we all have a relationship with food somehow because we all eat food every day. Not many people will have an opinion about training because not every people do 5 hours on the bike every day, but everyone eat food every day. So you'll have a lot of people with their own opinions about what's right and what's wrong. And then you have people in cycling who has been riders in the past or something like that, and then have their own opinions about nutrition. And a lot of people, they don't keep their opinions to themselves. Like they'll be open and loud about them. So it can be very hard working in cycling with nutrition just from that perspective.
I think in general, I suppose the health field, especially working with athletes in endurance sports, and we do see this, that to add to that, what you do see is that, something might work for someone, and that's N equals one. It worked for that one person. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for all. And like you say, perhaps some of the older cyclists or some people who have some credibility and have been there and done some things, and they're saying, yeah, I did this and it worked amazing for me, might not necessarily work that well for other people as well. And it's a real hard sell sometimes, and you spend a lot of your time debunking myths and having to try and educate from that perspective. I know Tim does a lot of that. I imagine that connection between chef, nutritionist and rider, there's probably some educational things going on there where people have said, I've been thinking about this, or I've seen this or done that. I imagine that's quite an important part of that role as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think luckily now, most teams are quite invested in nutrition. So it's definitely getting better, but it used to be people seeing what other people did when they were riding their bikes, and they would, just copy that because if someone was doing it, then it must be right. So a story about Chris Froome and Geraint Thomas going for a ride in Monaco, and they always had people joining them on the ride, and they would put an onion in the pocket. And then when they got back, they would, people were asking like, "Why the onion?" And they would see like, "No, that's the newest thing in nutrition that we will eat a raw onion after training." And within a few weeks, you see people riding around Monaco with onions in their pockets to like have a recovery onion after their ride.
I couldn't think of anything worse.
So I think that sort of highlights where we came from, where writers and staff and stuff would get their information from other writers and staff or social media, whereas now it's way more informed in most teams, and we have professionals taking care of it.
Yeah, and of course there's the whole saga around Chris Froome posting his omelette as a pre-race, and everyone was like, "Oh, it's super low carb, and just having an omelette for his breakfast before a big stage and things." And there's lots of context to these things, so it is fascinating. It is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think you can always spin it in whatever direction you want, and there's obviously people trying to push their own agenda, which I very much saw when I was helping out at the AIS with Louise Berg doing one of her big studies down there, where you know you would have people taking, as you said, a random picture from somewhere and then using that as evidence, but they didn't see that it might have been a time trial day, and that was just his light snack for breakfast, and then 3 hours before the stage, he would guzzle down 400 grams of pasta or something like that, and then he would get on the bike. So, social media, they're great and they're funny, but it takes things out of context.
Yeah, and it is becoming a difficult world.
I mean, Yeah, if I just like may add, like one of the things that like as a nutritionist in a professional cycling team or any like sports organization, I would be like, well, if everyone thinks that I'm so good at my work and we are successful, why not deceive the opponents by letting them know that we are doing something that we are actually not doing, just to basically make sure that we are still ahead of the game. So I still don't know how much of all these kind of things that you see on social networks and on the media is actually true and what isn't. But so you always, I feel like, need to take those things with a pinch of salt, especially when you just see one plate or one single moment in the 24-hour long day.
Yeah, for sure. So moving on to a little bit for the listeners, actually, based on your experience and your profession, is if we can give some tips to the amateurs or the general public out there, the listeners, again, some are very high level amateurs, but what would you say is the best way to tackle daily nutrition? What would be the approaches that you would take if you're advising the listeners?
I think one advice I would give to everyone, and I do this to even the athletes we work with today, is do the basics right, and then you can add all of the other things on top. But when we're talking about, semi-professionals or recreational athletes and stuff like that, I think the biggest thing is that a lot of them don't do fueling and recovery well. So they're not actually fueling enough on the bike and they're not recovering enough, which then leads to, cravings later in the day. And then they might end up eating food that's not the best option at that time. So I think that's where most people could improve from a nutrition side, is the fueling while they're training and the recovery food.
Okay, so is that my next question was going to be, what is one strategy that everyone should apply? And I'm guessing it is fueling and recovery.
Yeah, 100%. And I know, it's as a not sponsored athlete and stuff like that, it might be hard to justify spending that kind of money on nutrition products that you consume on the bike or in your other training, but it's money well spent, and I'll guarantee you that you'll be faster at your Ironman or your race, whatever you're competing in, doing your fueling right, rather than having, a specific disc wheel that'll cost you 2,000 euros or something like that. Like spend the money on nutrition instead. Um, if you weigh, 2 kilos less because you did your nutrition and stuff like that right, that's worth way more than saving 50 grams on a bottle cage or something like that.
Yeah. Awesome. And what is, so do you have some recipes, some go-to things for that because, some might be out there and I was just going to go back to your point, is that we've all been out on a ride and not fueled properly or not fueled at all and got back and gone, man, I'm just going to eat everything in the cupboard that I can see. And, that's never always a good thing, because you consume whatever is there without really thinking about it. But so for some of those that are perhaps not so in tune with, what types of foods you should be eating, are there a couple of go-to kind of recipes or things that we could think about to help with that strategy?
Or for training on the bike or afterwards, or
Okay, so both. Let's go. What
yeah.
are the best things to be having on the bike, and what are the best things that we can have afterwards?
I think usually on the bike, it's the different sports products at this point, they're pretty hard to beat. Endurance just introduced the watermelon drink, and I had bike riders who's been like, "Oh, this is the best thing ever." But if you want something that you prepare yourself for your bike ride, Rice Krispie bars. So a simple mix of Rice Krispies, marshmallows, you melt down and you make this like little Rice Krispie bar from that. That's pretty good on the bike. It's high carb, easy digestible. They're easy to transport and eat. I think that's a big thing when you're sitting on a bike. It needs to be something that you can actually eat while on the bike. Um, and then for recovery again, I want something that's preferably something that you can do before you do your ride, so it's ready in the fridge when you get home, so you can just pull it out and eat it. Um, it could be something like, overnight oats or something similar that you can keep in the fridge, or it can be um, a lot of our riders like sweet rice, like creamed sweet rice. Obviously done with not cream, but with milk or a vegetable substitute for that. Um, I think those are the main things that I would recommend for people at home.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you mentioned there around the use of sports products and solids as well, because people do have their preferences, and as we've spoke on previous episodes around, on longer rides we might want that solid food because it's a long time to be either taking gels or riding low intensity, whereas some of those higher intensity interval sessions, the harder sessions, bit easier to digest some of the gels and drinks as well there. So some of that, I imagine, probably with your riders as well, integrates depending on the session that they're doing.
Yeah, I think after we had the training bar, a lot of the riders, they were this is it white chocolate and cinnamon. They were like in love with
Yeah.
that one. Um, but for the, let's say, like we call them normal people out, like non-professional athletes at home, um, it's important to do what you feel comfortable with on the bike, but also to have in mind that when you need to race, you're not going to eat those things. So you also need to train with what you're going to eat at the race. Make sure that you're comfortable with eating those products, that you're comfortable with the amounts that you need to eat. And training that feeling is something that should be part of your training, especially leading into races.
Yeah, nice. And what are some of the key, or what is a key point that you've come across in your experience, which is best to avoid? What are the mistakes that we can see in this?
But don't go low carb. I would say
That's a
that's
good
the
one.
I've seen when we did those studies in Australia, some of the low carb guys, they would pass out because they just couldn't do anymore. And you've seen bike riders who try to do low carb just start pedaling backwards in the peloton. Like just whatever you do, don't do low carb for a race or anything like that.
It's a good one. It's a good one. So we're just going to finish off with a quick fire question and answer. So, a couple of words in your answer. So, first off, what is your favorite pre-race meal to cook for the riders?
Um, my homemade bread with jam. Can't beat it. Can't beat a fresh baked bread with jam.
Nice. And what meal don't you like to prepare, if any?
Um, I don't really enjoy doing the breakfast because I hate getting up early in the morning.
And would you say that my next question was going to be, what is the hardest to prepare? And that might not be technically, but it might be, logistics or execution. So it might be breakfast because you've got to get up.
No, I think for that one it would probably be like a time trial day because you're just sitting waiting to cook, 300
Okay.
grams of rice, two eggs, then you wait another hour and you do the same again.
And you've got
So I think,
riders, yeah, all different time points, haven't you?
yeah.
Um, what is one supplement that every endurance athlete should consider?
Um, I think for non-professional athletes, I would consider creatine something that everyone should probably add into their regimen, or could add into their regimen.
Okay, interesting. What is, or one of the biggest myths that you see in cycling today, and this might be within the pro field or just in general?
Um, that's a tough one. Um, I think that in the pro field is that everyone thinks that, other teams have found the magic bullet. Um, yeah,
Omelette for breakfast, I heard.
it's it's whatever. It will be like someone heard that, they're doing this or that, but yeah, everyone always thinks that other teams are doing better, whether that being, different tires, different wheels, that's why they're winning. It's just because of that.
And finally, just because we're kind of coming out of it now, but what would be, there's two sides to this. What's your go-to comfort food for what you'd perceive as the off season, and what is a go-to comfort food for the riders for the off season?
Oh, for the off season, I think a lot of the riders, they really enjoy having not to focus. So their comfort food is actually eating what they would like instead of having to eat what they need for performance. I think a lot of them comfort food is not eating 400 grams of pasta.
Yeah, because it's not that comfortable, is it?
Not every day. No, not every day. Not every day.
Amazing. So do you have any questions to add to that, Tim?
Yeah, I don't no. No. I think like it was a great chat with Nicki, and yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thank you ever so much. And I think if there's anything that the listeners out there can take away is, let's get the basics right. Focus on that fueling during your workouts, that recovery. You've got some great examples from yourself there, and some great insights into the role of both a nutritionist and a chef within the pro cycling field. So we can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast today, and we hope that you've enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, no, it's been great talking to you guys, and yeah, sometimes reflecting a bit on the things we do every day.
Yeah, it's sometimes nice to do that as well. And I'm sure the listeners have got a lot out of that as well, to understand that, it's not all that magical at the top, but we do get the basics right. So for everyone listening, we hope you thoroughly enjoyed that session. We certainly enjoyed discussing it. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Cheers.
Thank you.